Did you know that sound almost ruined movies? If you didn't know, before there was sound in movies, all movies were silent. And that lasted roughly from 1894 to 1929. Now, a lot of people think that The Jazz Singer in 1927 was the first movie with sound.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
But in actuality, the idea of sound had been around since the invention of cinema. Thomas Edison, one of the most important figures in creating movie cameras, had commissioned the kinetograph, an old version of a camera, to provide images for his phonograph, an old way of listening to audio recordings. William Dixon had actually synchronized the two machines and called it the kinetophone in the 1890s. Léon Gaumond's chronophone in France and Cecil Hepworth's Vitaphone system in England had similar technologies and were used to make hundreds of synchronized sound shorts between 1902 and 1912. In Germany, producer-director Oscar Mester began releasing all of his films with synchronized music to them as early as 1908. I'm saying all this to say that sound in movies was always around. Now, by the time feature films became the dominant way of showing movies, typically they were accompanied by an orchestral arrangement, but actual recorded sound required amplification for sustained use, which became possible only after Lee DeForest perfected the Audion tube in 1907, which was a vacuum tube that magnified sound and drove it through speakers so that the audience could hear. In 1919, DeForest developed an optical sound-on-film process called phonofilm, and between 1923 and 1927, he had made over 1,000 synchronized sound shorts. Now, the public was very interested in this, but the movie studios weren't. See, they saw it as an overly expensive novelty act. By that time, Western Electric had also created a sophisticated sound-on-disc system called the Vitaphone, which their representatives were also trying to market to Hollywood. Like DeForest, they were rebuffed by every Hollywood studios except for Warner Brothers. Now, all the major studios didn't want to do it, but Warner Brothers at the time was a minor studio, and they were trying to take advantage of the Novelty Act, looking to make some quick cash. So they bought both the system and the rights to lease it to other studios. They were going to use it so that their films could have longer runs with exhibitors that couldn't afford an orchestra. Now, their first synchronized sound film was Don Juan in 1926, which featured a score performed by the New York Philharmonic. The response was so enthusiastic to this that Warner Brothers announced that all of their films in 1927 would be synchronized with sound, and all of their attention was put on their second sound synchronized film, The Jazz Singer, in 1927. The Jazz Singer included dialogue and popular music and orchestral scores, and it was a phenomenal success that forced the industry into the sound era. Now, all in all, the transition from silent to sound took about 15 months for the film industry, between late 1927 and 1929. And the profits for the major studios increased by 600%, which they needed because all of these companies were forced to borrow upwards of $350 million, which is a whole lot of money in the 1920s, which placed them in direct control of the two major New York financial groups, the Morgan Group and the Rockefeller Group. Now, enough with the background, let's fast forward a little bit to see how sound almost ruined movies completely. Inside the newly sound-wired theaters and movie studios, it was a complete mess. There were three competing sound systems, the Vitaphone, the Movietone, and the Photophone, and they were all initially incompatible with each other. And the technology was moving so fast that a lot of times before the equipment had even got out of the box, it was already obsolete. No matter what the producers chose to use for their sound, the exhibitors during this time were forced to have both sound on film and sound on disc systems. Even as late as 1931, sound on disc systems were still being used. But the biggest issue wasn't with the exhibition of the films, but in the production of them. There's a famous statement from the time that says, "The movies ceased to move when they began to talk," which accurately describes the problems they had with syncing sound and pictures. Mostly because of the technological limitations, the cameras and the actors stopped moving. Early microphones were large and clumsy to move, so they had to be in one stationary spot on set, and the actors had to speak directly into the microphone for it to be heard, which means the actors couldn't move because the microphones couldn't follow them, and if the microphone was placed in one spot, they were stationary and locked down to that spot so that their voices could be picked up by the mics. So they had to be completely motionless when delivering dialogue. To make it worse, microphones back then were omnidirectional, meaning they would pick up sound from everywhere, especially the loud motors of cameras. In 1929, camera motors were synchronized to 24 frames a second to make sure that sound synchronization wasn't distorted. But before then, in the silent era, cameras were mostly hand cranked. averaging speeds around 16 to 18 frames per second. To prevent accidentally recording the sound of the motor of the camera, cameras were placed in 6-foot by 6-foot boxes, facetiously nicknamed ice boxes because they were so extremely hot. So the camera, as well as the camera operator, were stuck inside of these boxes, which gave them very little room to maneuver. Because of these boxes, cameras couldn't be mounted on cranes, they couldn't be dollied in, and they could only pan about 30 degrees in each direction. So combining the camera immobility with the actor's immobility, movies became visually boring. It was almost like watching a stage play rather than an actual film. You'll see this in a lot of early sound films. But the impact of sound on editing was even worse. You see, back then, sound and picture had to be recorded simultaneously. You see, in sound on disc films, scenes were initially made to play for 10 minutes at a time in order to record the dialogue continuously on 16-inch discs. Such scenes were impossible to edit until re-recording technology was perfected in the 1930s. Before then, it was difficult to make cuts on film without ruining relevant portions of sound. In general, cuts could only be made and the camera could only be moved when no sound was being recorded on set. As a result, no matter what type of film you were using, what type of sound recording devices they were using, edits were purely functional, which took away a lot of the artistry of editing. Most of these technological problems were resolved by 1933. Sound on disc, for example, was abandoned in 1930, and by 1931, all studios have removed their cameras from sound boxes and converted them to use lightweight soundproofing devices called blimps, which basically just muffled the sound coming out of the camera. As time passed, cameras became smaller and quieter, and also came with self-insulating sound devices, eliminating the need for soundproofing altogether. It even became possible to move cameras again while using booms, cranes, and dollies. Microphones even became more mobile with various booms that were created in 1930. These big boom arms allowed microphones to be moved around so that they can follow actors as they moved. And in 1931, microphones also became more directional, not picking up sounds from things that it wasn't pointed at. But the thing that really saved sound and film synchronization was post-synchronization, also known as re-recording or dubbing, which separated image from sound and allowed editors to edit them separately, which means filmmakers were free to edit images alone again. Though there were many filmmakers that thought that if you edited sound separate from image, it would confuse the audience. So there was resistance to post-synchronization. Post-synchronization seems to first have been used by director King Vidor in his film Hallelujah in 1929. Vidor shot on location without sound and then added both naturalistic and impressionistic sound effects later on. In the following year, Louis Millstone's All Quiet on the Western Front and G.W. Papp's West Front 1918 both used post-synchronization for their battle scenes as well. Now, other changes from the way that movies were made from the sound era were purely human, meaning the people that were making them couldn't do what they used to do. For instance, directors used to yell out directions to actors as the camera was rolling. There was also often mood music being played for the actors to get into the zone. Not to mention, a lot of times there were multiple shoots happening all at once, all in the same location. Silent era film shoots were chaotic, but all of that had to change. Beyond that, actors with voices that were unpleasant had to stop acting because audiences didn't want to hear them speak. Many actors found they couldn't learn lines, and others found that their thick foreign accents didn't translate well to an American audience. Sound forced new technologies and new ways of looking at film, which means different stories were being told. Urban settings became more popular in cinema, which relied on authentic sounding vernacular. The public's fascination with speech also spawned the biopic, and obviously musicals became the biggest genre at the time. Sound technology continued to be advanced with people like Walt Disney, who pioneered a new genre called the animated musical with the Skeletons Dance in 1929. And the great thing about it was he wasn't tied down to the awkward and cumbersome technology that live action films had to use. Long story short, guys, sound almost ruined pictures. They almost ruined the artistry and the motion and the expressiveness of film. But now, sound and pictures go hand in hand to create something beautiful. Yes, cinema is a primarily visual art form, but without sound, a lot of those visuals don't have the same impact. Imagine, for instance, a Steven Spielberg film without John Williams' scores, or Star Wars without its sound design. Sound and pictures go hand in hand, and thank goodness they got it right.